Welcome to today's deep dive. Today we are exploring a paper by the psycholinguist Hervé Ngaté.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating one called La Classe Thérapeutique, or the Therapeutic Class.
Right. And our mission for this deep dive is, well, to really uncover the hidden psychological battlefield of learning a new language.
Mhm.
We're going to examine why our brains glitch in these spectacular, frankly, embarrassing ways when we try to speak a foreign language.
And importantly, how treating a language classroom more like a therapy session can actually be the key to unlocking fluency.
Exactly. So there's this quote from one of Ngaté's own students that just captures the core of this phenomenon perfectly. They said, "The more I am involved in learning French, the more it is confusing my English."
I mean, that just perfectly articulates the chaos happening under the surface, doesn't it?
Oh, totally.
Because a lot of people approach language acquisition, and in this case, Ngaté is focusing specifically on French as a foreign language as like a purely academic exercise.
Right, like you're just studying math or something.
Exactly. The assumption is that you just need to, upload a new set of vocabulary words and grammar rules into your brain and you're good to go.
But that's not what happens at all.
No, not at all. Ngaté's work, which draws heavily on psycholinguistics, reveals that this is fundamentally a profound psychological conflict. We are looking at the mechanics of why the brain actively resists this new information.
Okay, let's unpack this conflict. Because if we use, like, a computer analogy, learning a second language isn't just downloading a new app.
Right.
It feels more like trying to install a brand new operating system while the old operating system is, actively fighting back to stay in control.
That is a great way to put it.
The old system starts throwing up error messages, crashing programs, and just doing everything it can to reject the new code.
Yeah, and that structural resistance brings us to the theoretical root of Ngaté's paper. To really understand the friction, we have to look at why learning a second language, the L2, interferes so heavily with the first language, the L1.
And he pulls from another framework for this, right?
He does. He relies on a framework established by the sociolinguist Boyer back in 1996, which basically posits that language learners are placed in a constant state of what he calls psychic conflict.
Psychic conflict.
Yeah.
I mean, that sounds incredibly intense for, like, a Tuesday night conversational French class.
It sounds super dramatic.
It really does. So if we move past the basic idea of just swapping an English word for a French word, what is actually causing that level of internal warfare?
Well, the conflict arises because you aren't just swapping vocabulary. That's the misconception. Boyer clarifies that moving from an L1 to an L2 requires a complete and total change of your linguistic, cultural, and social repertoires.
Okay, repertoires. Can you define that in this context?
Sure. So a repertoire here is basically the entire framework of how you perceive and interact with reality.
Oh, wow. So it's everything.
Exactly. It dictates how you show respect, how you use humor, how you assert your boundaries, and even how you read social cues.
So it's the actual rules of engagement for being a human.
Yes. So when you attempt to acquire a new language, you're being asked to suspend the cultural lens you've relied on your entire life and adopt an entirely alien social framework.
But if it is this complete shift in your social and cultural repertoire, why does it physically and mentally drain us so much? I mean, what is actually happening in the brain's architecture to make an hour of French practice feel like you just ran a marathon?
Right. The exhaustion comes from the brain perceiving this new L2 operating system as an active threat.
A threat, like it thinks it's under attack.
Yes. Your mother tongue, your L1, is inextricably linked to your core identity. It's the tool you've used to navigate the world and build relationships since childhood.
Right, it's who you are.
So when you immerse yourself in an L2 environment, the brain's defense mechanisms just flare up. The psychic conflict that Ngaté describes is the cognitive struggle of trying to absorb this new foreign framework while your brain desperately attempts to preserve and protect your mother tongue.
And by extension, protecting your core identity.
Exactly. It's a dual-task interference happening on the subconscious level, and that consumes massive, massive amounts of cognitive energy.
Here is where the mechanics of this turf war gets super fascinating to me. Because this psychic conflict, it doesn't just stay quietly hidden in the subconscious, does it?
No, it definitely doesn't.
The cognitive load gets so heavy that the pressure eventually leaks out into the real world, and usually at the absolute worst possible moments.
Yeah, the internal struggle manifests externally, and the results give us a really clear window into just how overloaded the brain's processing centers actually are.
In linguistics, these are called lapses, right? like
Yeah,
slips
yeah.
of the tongue.
That's right, lapsus.
And Ngaté documented some very specific mistakes his adult students made during oral speaking tasks in his French classes. The contrast between what they wanted to say and what their panic brains actually blurted out is just jarring.
Oh, they are incredible examples.
Like, okay, for instance, a student was trying to say they like Beyoncé's face. The actual phrase is, "J'aime la face de Beyoncé." But under pressure, the brain just grabs the nearest phonetic match and they say, "J'aime la fesse de Beyoncé."
Which means,
I like Beyoncé's butt.
right, the phonetic proximity just completely overrides the semantic meaning.
Completely overrides it. And there's another one. A student wanted to say, "I'm looking for where to get a haircut," which is, "Je cherche où me couper les cheveux." Instead, they blurted out, "Je cherche où me couper la tête."
Which translates to
"I'm looking for where to cut off my head."
a completely morbid shift in the conversation.
Super morbid. Then you have English speakers trying to discuss music. They want to talk about the beat of a song. But they accidentally use the French slang la bite, which is a highly explicit term for male anatomy.
Yeah, that one comes up a lot, actually.
I bet. Or a student trying to say, "I really like sleeping," using the verb dormir. Instead, they use coucher, turning "I really like sleeping" into "I really like sleeping with people."
Yeah, that's rough.
So rough. And then one of the most glaring glitches. A student trying to tell the teacher, "I like chocolate, so j'aime le chocolat," crosses the wires with, "I love you," looking the teacher dead in the eye and saying, "Je t'aime le chocolat," I love you, the chocolate.
I mean, while those examples highlight the absurdity of the brain under pressure, we really have to examine the psychological fallout of these moments.
Because it's not just funny in the moment.
No, exactly. For you listening, these mistakes might seem like harmless, funny anecdotes. But Ngaté brings in research from Pirlo, conducted back in 2011, to explain the severe negative impact these confusions have on the acquisition process itself.
So the mistake actually hurts the learning process.
Yes. The lapsus isn't just a symptom of the psychic conflict, it becomes a catalyst for further cognitive blockage.
Because, in the moment, the learner isn't laughing. They are an intelligent, capable adult who just accidentally propositioned their entire classroom or insulted their professor. The humiliation must be completely overwhelming.
And that embarrassment triggers an acute stress response. When that happens, the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, activates.
Okay.
And this activation physically impairs the prefrontal cortex, which is the exact region of the brain responsible for complex processing, working memory, and language production.
So the learner literally freezes.
They freeze. The immense stress discourages them, leading to a vicious cycle. The psychic conflict causes the lapsus generates intense social embarrassment. The resulting stress physiologically blocks further learning, which in turn causes more mistakes.
Wow. It functions exactly like a pressure valve releasing steam.
Yeah, it's a good analogy.
Like the brain is holding back so much pressure, trying to manage this massive cultural and linguistic repertoire shift. When the learner is finally forced to produce speech, the valve just blows.
Right.
The brain grabs the absolute nearest sounding word like fess instead of face, regardless of the social consequences, purely to relieve the immediate cognitive pressure.
And recognizing that vicious cycle of stress and cognitive blockage is what leads to Ngaté's core thesis.
Which is?
Well, if the fundamental barrier to language acquisition isn't a lack of intelligence or a poor vocabulary, or rather debilitating psychological stress, then the educational solution must be therapeutic in its design.
Okay, so treating the root cause rather than just treating the symptom.
Precisely. That is the paradigm shift Ngaté is advocating for. He introduces a framework established by the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, the CEFR, from the year 2000.
Okay, what is it called?
It's known as the perspective actionnel, or the action-oriented approach.
So for those of us who haven't read the CEFR guidelines, what are the actual mechanics of an action-oriented approach? Are we talking about students performing physical actions, or is it more of a psychological reframing?
It's a profound psychological reframing of the classroom environment itself. Building on the CEFR, researcher Purin suggested in 2006 that educators must completely stop viewing the language class as a simple transmission vector, where rules are just handed down to passive students.
Right, the old school lecture model.
Exactly. Instead, the class has to be engineered into a full-fledged social group. The goal of this therapeutic class is to transform abstract learning exercises into real, tangible actions performed collectively within that microsociety.
So the language shifts from being the final goal to merely being the tool used to accomplish a shared group task.
Yes. That shift in utility is what lowers the defense mechanisms. When learners act as social agents completing a task together, they liberate themselves from the isolated stress of academic performance.
That makes a lot of sense.
And if a teacher understands that verbal confusions are not signs of a student's incompetence, but rather evidence of active psychic conflict, they can manage the room differently.
They don't just mark off points for a wrong word.
Right. Crucially, this framework helps the learner understand their own mind, too. They begin to realize their brain is just managing a complex conflict, which immediately removes the sting of personal failure.
I love that. But I want to challenge the practicality of this for a moment.
Sure.
Because the theory of a supportive microsociety is brilliant. But for a listener who is, currently grinding through a language app on a crowded train or sitting in some fluorescent lit night class right now, how does a teacher actually dismantle a highly stressful, grades-focused academic environment and replace it with a therapeutic social group?
Right. What's the actual implementation?
Yeah, what does the execution of this theory actually look like?
Well, theory without application leaves learners stranded, which Ngaté understands. So he outlines 3 astute, highly actionable strategies to construct this therapeutic environment, reduce psychic stress, and actively accelerate language acquisition.
Awesome. How does he suggest educators begin disarming the conflict?
The first mechanism is the active integration of interculturality.
Intercultural?
Yeah. Ngaté observed that when he prompted his learners to express the cultural dimensions of the class activities, essentially asking them to bring their native L1 culture into the room and actively compare it to the target L2 culture, their confidence metrics rose significantly.
That's so interesting, because by doing that, the teacher isn't asking the student to check their identity at the door. You are explicitly validating their original operating system.
Yes. It completely neutralizes the threat response we discussed earlier. When the primary repertoire is validated rather than suppressed, the brain no longer treats the L2 as an invading force that's going to overwrite the student's core identity.
So they can coexist.
Exactly. The relationship between the 2 languages becomes collaborative rather than competitive, which dramatically increases the learner's motivation and cognitive availability.
And that structural validation seems to set the stage perfectly for the second strategy, which seems to tackle the lapses problem head-on, the strategic use of humor.
Humor is not just an icebreaker here. It is an indispensable psychological tool.
Because when a student accidentally says, "J'aime la fête de Beyoncé," the immediate physical reaction in the room is tension.
Total silence.
Your students' cortisol spikes, and they likely want to just disappear into the floor. But Ngaté points out that if the teacher intercepts that mistake with genuine humor, it gently redirects the energy and completely alters the physiology of the room.
The humor acts as an immediate circuit breaker for the amygdala. It prevents the stress response from taking hold. The focal point of the entire room shifts.
So they stop panicking.
Exactly. The learners stop obsessing over the insurmountable difficulty of the language and their own perceived shortcomings, and instead, they anchor into the shared communal enjoyment of the environment.
Ngaté specifically notes the physical outcome of this shift, and it is fascinating. He states that in these humor-integrated classes at the end of the lesson, no one is fatigued.
Which is huge.
It's huge.
Yeah.
Nobody is rushing for the door. They're actually waiting impatiently for the next session. It essentially proves that the deep exhaustion associated with language learning isn't purely cognitive. It is emotional.
That is a critical distinction. The cognitive stamina required to process a new language is high, sure, but it is the emotional weight of anxiety and embarrassment that actually drains the battery.
Right.
When you remove that emotional weight through shared humor, the brain's endurance increases exponentially.
Okay, so interculturality prevents the identity threat, and humor diffuses the performance anxiety. But what happens when the frustration just boils over?
Because it inevitably will.
Right, because no matter how supportive the group is, the cognitive friction is still there. Do the students just have to sit there and smile through the pain of not being able to express complex thoughts?
That exact bottleneck leads to Ngaté's third and perhaps most controversial strategy. Yeah, he argues that teachers must allow learners to explicitly express their difficulties and frustrations, and they must be permitted to do so using their mother tongue, their L1.
Wow, okay. That flies in the face of almost every traditional language pedagogy out there. You constantly hear about strict immersion models where speaking a single word of your native language is heavily penalized. The rule is usually, only French in this classroom.
Right. The traditional immersion model relies on forced adaptation, but in a therapeutic class, the pedagogical priority is treating the learner's cognitive pain over enforcing strict adherence to the target language.
So their well-being comes first.
Yes, the educator must demonstrate a genuine interest in the psychological struggle the student is enduring. Ngaté applies a fundamental truth from clinical psychology to the classroom. The more a person is able to articulate their psychological suffering, the more immediate relief they experience.
For you listening right now, if you are deep in the trenches of trying to acquire a new language, this is incredibly validating. You shouldn't punish yourself for retreating to your native tongue to vent your frustration. It often feels like a failure, like you are breaking the rules or giving up. But Ngaté's research frames it as a highly effective, valid psychological mechanism.
You are literally opening the pressure valve so your brain can reset and keep pushing forward.
Exactly.
Permitting that L1 venting serves a dual purpose, too. It relieves the learner's immediate psychic pressure, but it also provides the educator with crucial diagnostic data.
Oh, because they can actually explain what's wrong.
Right. If a teacher forces a struggling student to explain why they are confused using a language they haven't mastered yet, the feedback is useless. By allowing the learner to use their native discourse, the teacher gets a precise understanding of exactly where the cognitive roadblocks are located.
It is the exact same protocol as physical therapy after a major injury.
That's a great comparison.
A skilled physical therapist doesn't just force you to execute painful repetitions in total silence. They engage with you. They ask, where is the pain radiating? Is it a sharp pain or a dull ache? They use humor to get you through the hardest parts of the exercise.
Right.
And if a specific movement is causing structural damage rather than building strength, they adapt the exercise to fit the reality of your specific body. They treat the entire person, not just an isolated muscle group.
The analogy holds up perfectly. Language acquisition must adapt to the psychological reality of the individual learner. The brain is recovering from the strain of mapping a new reality, and it requires therapeutic support, not rigid punishment.
So, to synthesize the journey we've taken today through Ngaté's La Classe Thérapeutique, we are looking at a massive paradigm shift in how we understand fluency. Language learning is far more than memorizing conjugation tables and vocabulary flashcards.
It really is.
It is an intense, active psychic conflict between two fundamentally different cultural and social operating systems competing for dominance in the brain.
A conflict that generates debilitating stress, resulting in those spectacular, humiliating slips of the tongue, which historically just fuels a cycle of further anxiety and cognitive failure.
But the solution is right there in the social dynamic. By integrating interculturality to validate the learner's identity, employing humor to short-circuit the brain's threat response, and treating frustration as a valid, necessary part of the process that deserves to be voiced, we can finally stop fighting our own minds.
We can dismantle the psychological defenses and actually begin the work of genuine communication.
It is worth noting that Ngaté leaves the conclusion of his paper open-ended. He states clearly that these three strategies are not an exhaustive list.
Right. It's just the beginning.
He extends an invitation to both educators and learners to continue analyzing the psychological battlefield and to share new methods for disarming the stress of acquisition.
It fundamentally changes how you view anyone attempting to speak a second language, doesn't it? You realize they aren't just reciting words, they are navigating an invisible psychological minefield in real time. Which leaves us with a fascinating implication to consider long after this deep dive concludes.
What's that?
Well, if effectively learning a second language requires a complete foundational shift in your social and cultural repertoire, and if you have to fundamentally rewire the way your brain processes reality just to resolve this internal psychic conflict, does becoming perfectly fluent in a new language ultimately change who you are?
Oh, wow.
By fully acquiring and integrating this new identity, are you quietly overwriting a small fundamental piece of your original self?
The new operating system might just require the deletion of some original code to run smoothly. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the hidden mechanics of the mind. Keep learning, keep laughing at the inevitable glitches, and above all, stay curious.